Welcome to the Agile on the Mind podcast, where we discuss how to build intelligent teams inspired by agility in the world of cognitive science. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the Agile on the Mind Substack. To receive a free weekly newsletter with explorations of agility and cognitive science, complete with tools, tips and tricks, go to agileonthemind.substack.com. This week's guest is Mazviita Chirimuuta, who is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going to hand over to Mazviita shortly to introduce more about how she landed through the worlds of philosophy and science into what she does now. But I heard Mazviita talking about cognitive science and about abstraction in a podcast a few months ago, and I thought this would be a brilliant conversation to have in the context of teams and working there. And since then, I've read her wonderful book, The Brain Abstracted, which I'm sure we'll go into in the episode. And I'm very excited to welcome Mazviita Chirimuuta to Agile on the Mind. Welcome.
Thank you, Daniel. It's very nice to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you landed through the worlds of psychology, of philosophy, of cognitive science, through to what you do now?
Yeah, psychology is not completely off the mark, because actually my first degree was in philosophy and psychology, I should say. I did that at the University of Bristol. I was always curious about the relationship between philosophical and scientific perspectives on the mind. And I thought for a long time as an undergraduate, I would go straight into doing a PhD in philosophy. But I got a bit of a bug for experimental research on the visual system through this quite charismatic lecturer that I had at Bristol in the psychology department, Tom Troshenko, the late Tom Troshenko. And he introduced me to experimental science in the sense of like running your own experiments, designing a project from the ground up, going to conferences and presenting it. And that actually gave me the idea of going on to do a PhD in a similar field of research. So I was doing experiments on the human visual system, sometimes using myself as an experimental subject, so looking at images on a screen and collecting data about thresholds, sensitivities. And but I was actually doing my PhD at Cambridge with David Tolhurst in what was effectively a physiology department. It's now sort of kind of merged and reconfigured into a sort of neuroscience department. So really, my home then became a branch of psychology, psychophysics on the border with neuroscience. And that appealed to me because I thought, well, if we're really going to understand the mind, then we should be looking closely at the brain. So learning as much as I could at that stage about how primary visual cortex works, what had been learned from doing recordings in the brains of animals about how then individual neurons respond to different visual stimuli, and using that as a starting point to actually understand human perception. That methodology really appealed to me at the time. So, and that was what I was able to explore with my PhD. So the experimental work, again, was psychophysics, these human experiments, but we were doing some modeling using simulations of how individual primary visual cortex neurons respond to these visual stimuli from experiments that have been done in other labs, and trying to put together the psychology and the neuroscience of visual perception.
So what is it about vision that makes it a good starting point for understanding brains and the mind?
I would say it's so the visual system is the area of the brain, at least when I was being trained, which had done had the most experimental research done on it. I think vision appeals to many people, including myself, as a subject of inquiry, because it's the sense that gives us the most sense of actually being in touch with the world, having knowledge of the world, actually things showing up for us. And so to understand how that works at the neural level is really appealing. And the thing about the sensory areas of the brain is that you can get responses which are quite heavily correlated with the stimuli that you happen to introduce to the person or animal. Other parts of the brain, sort of deeper into the brain, so more connections on from the immediate sensory input areas, if you like, they're modulated by too many different factors, so it's much harder to interpret what those neural responses are. But with sensory-driven neurons, by sort of controlling things in an experimental scenario, choosing certain kinds of stimuli, you can get quite a good handle on the kind of preferences an individual neuron will have. And you can say, aha, this neuron has the function of doing this kind of filtering for the visual system. It's much more easy to interpret what neural responses are when you're looking at sensory areas than deeper into the brain, I'd say.
So I'm trying to understand which bits of the brain are related to which functions and things like that. And it's easier to like flash up an image and see what lights up every time than asking someone to remember something or to, I don't know what other examples of that would be. So there's just, it's easier to measure, it's easier to work with as a scientist.
Yeah, I would say there's loads of research done on other parts of the brains where obviously people have looked at how different neural activations correspond to different tasks. So on humans, this is normally done with fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, when you get someone in a big scanner and you're looking at activations, how they fluctuate across the brain. And so with memory tasks, all kinds of decision-making tasks, like other parts of the brain, non-sensory areas, you can still get responses, and you still can try and theorize how those responses map onto cognitive functions. But I would say at the level of interpreting the particular response profile of individual neurons, for a long time, this was done with most precision in visual cortex, especially the most, if you like, external part of visual cortex, which is the bit at the back of the brain, primary visual cortex. And then I'd say other areas have had this kind of treatment in terms of single neuron specificity, particularly the hippocampus. So I don't know if you came across in the media a few years back, the Nobel Prize went to various neuroscientists who had studied place cells and grid cells. These are cells in the hippocampus, in the area around the hippocampus, which seem to correlate very closely with location in space, often reported as the brain's internal GPS system.
There's a million options of where to go from there. But I'm trying to put myself in the minds of the listener who might be saying, well, this visual stuff is interesting, but what does that have to do with philosophy and the philosophy of mind? How do I get from understanding the response profile of one visual neuron or a bunch of them when I flash an image in front of them, or these kind of things, to understandings of intelligence, mind, all that kind of stuff? So how can you give us some direction there? What's the relationship between those worlds?
Well, I can carry on with my buildings from my life story, because I've only got up to my PhD, this is what I was doing back then. But yeah, the question came to me, okay, so how do I sort of transfer this back to the question that I started out with, which is I want to answer philosophical questions about the mind. Yeah, and I have to say that as much as I enjoyed working in a lab, the philosophical bug never quite left me. So as a side interest, carrying on reading and talking to philosophers. So I decided to do something a bit unusual as a postdoc for my first post-PhD training, which is to write to lots of philosophers and say, will you hire me as a postdoc even though I don't have a PhD in philosophy? Can we collaborate on some project which connects the two disciplines? And the obvious place to go was philosophy of perception. And one philosopher was kind enough to actually give me a chance. So he wrote a grant proposal for me to do a postdoc studying the problem of color vision, which in philosophy is the problem of when we look at the world and we experience all of these rich various colors, are those colors actually real, like part of external reality, or are they just like an illusion generated by our brains or our mind? So yeah, I was really lucky to get a 3-year postdoc in Australia, funded by the Australian Research Council, to dip my toe back in philosophy, doing a project which was about the intersection between philosophy and the science, both psychology and neuroscience, of the color visual system. And that was my first book. It's called Outside Color, and it's presenting a theory of what colors are based on an interpretation I give of what the science is telling us.
Is there like an explain like I'm 5 version of a really rich question that's been going back for hundreds of years? What is color?
Yeah, so the answer that I end up with there is, it's like I sit on the fence. I say it's yes or no. It's both in the head and outside in the external world. So not wanting to say it's merely a projection or an illusion, but wanting to give credit for the fact that the way that we experience colors, the reality of colors for us, is deeply shaped by how our visual systems happen to operate. So what I end up proposing is that colors are properties of how we interact with the environment. So whenever we look around, we're interacting visually with the environment, and those interactions, those processes themselves have properties, and I say that colors are properties of those interactions.
In doing a small amount of my own reading on this, this kind of question exposes the fact that so many of the things that we're interested in when we're thinking about perception and action and mind they're not about just the brain or just the body, but they are about relationships between an organism and its environment.
Exactly.
And from bringing it back to the sort of teams world that I'm coming from, often we think about team improvement as if this team is something that has everything that it needs to be able to do all the work, without thinking about the relationships that are between the team and the users that they're surveying, or their customers, or the rest of the organization, or something like that. So there's something about color and cognition as being about relationships that for me maps really beautifully back to that organism that is a team, this big distributed flock.
Yeah, and I have to say the original inspiration that I got from this piece goes back to a scientist that I first encountered back with lectures of Tom Troshenko in Bristol, which is J.J. Gibson, the ecological psychologist. And his point about you have to understand perception by looking at that organism.
So my understanding is that the cognitive science as a discipline differs from neuroscience or differs from psychology because it embeds a philosophical approach in it as well, and questions, what's the starting point here? Is it one human? Is it one brain? Is it one neuron? Is it one organism? Is it one species? Is it all of it in its environment, and those kind of things? So when I can imagine for you, when you see people talking about brains and minds and intelligence out there in the world, is that a very frustrating experience? Because you're like, well, that's the way you've articulated that thing on the news that's very Kantian, and we don't accept that anymore.
Oh no, Kant is one of my favorite philosophers. The more Kantian, the better. No, I mean my new book. So to continue with the story of my life, the new book is actually stemming from a certain dissatisfaction with how the marriage of philosophy and neuroscience has gone on over the decades, with neuroscience being taken very much as being the leading partner, and philosophers having to defer largely to neuroscientists in their accounts of what are the nature of various cognitive capacities. At least that is how this marriage between neuroscience and philosophy was first envisaged to be, this movement called neurophilosophy, which was quite widely publicized through the work of Patricia and Paul Churchland. So a lot of people heard this proposal that if you take old philosophical questions about the nature of the mind, philosophers have just been incapable for millennia in giving us any satisfactory answers of this. But now we have electrodes, we can poke in brains, we have scanners. Now we'll find the answers to that. But the more and more I looked at this, and this is something I noticed when I wrote my first book, the more you probe into what the science is telling you about any of these issues, you often find that the scientists themselves are having to make philosophical assumptions, which means that they're not neutral arbiters about, just providing evidence for these philosophical questions. And also, the science has to make a whole range of simplifying assumptions, which are not there because they're capturing the truth of how things are, but they're made for the practical reasons that scientists have to perform simplifications. And this led me to worry about how often neuroscientific results are presented to the public as this is telling us what it means to be in love. Look, we've got fMRI here. Well, no, if you're not explaining to people all of the steps along the way that lead to that conclusion through experimental design, through post-processing of data, all kinds of statistical assumptions, introduce a whole sort of interpretative gap between what these data could be telling you and what all of these phenomena, these rich phenomena are that we experience in our everyday lives.
So Joe Public believes that when the scientists say something, that's kind of objective in a way, right? And they've like looked and they've stripped out all of the bias, and their tools and their statistics are going to make this the neutral version of the truth. Whereas it sounds like what you're saying is scientists, especially if they're like unconscious of the philosophical assumptions of their work, will come in and make findings and proclamations and things that are based very much in certain philosophical starting points, and they're not neutral. Was there anything in writing that book that when you dug into it really surprised you, or you thought you had a starting point where you're like, I'm going to get this down, and the more you dug into it, you found something unexpected?
Yeah, I mean, for both books, these are projects that from when I first conceived the idea of beginning to work on this about a book, it was like 10 years in the making. So certainly my ideas changed a lot along the way. And one of the things that is exciting about doing work that is at the interface with science is that the science is always can always surprise you. New findings come out, new things are happening all the time, which can make you question a lot of your preconceived ideas. So I don't want to dismiss the role of science in philosophy, because precisely like getting you out of your settled opinions is one of the things that is really valuable about being science facing.
So you mentioned earlier about simplifications and abstractions. Can you give us some examples of what a simplification might look like? What are some of the simplifications that scientists make?
Well, if you've I would say for anyone that's been sort of had minimal training in a scientific discipline, you will notice that part of what you're trained to do is make things more simple than they already are. So if you introductory physics, you'll make assumptions about, oh, there's no friction on this plane, right? Just things as basic as that. In high school physics, you would describe the world as having fewer sort of causal variables in it than it actually does. So that is, if you like, the most widespread, familiar kind of simplifying strategy that everyone should be aware of to some degree. Though I would emphasize that in popular science presentations, this is normally really neglected. And I think it's weird that popular science is written as if scientists don't make simplifying strategies, and I find that strange. And we can discuss ideologically why that might be. But the book that I wrote, The Brain Abstracted, is about simplification in neuroscience. And I sort of surveyed across from my own experience of working in a lab to then sort of later familiarity with parts of neuroscience that I'd read about but hadn't done myself. And I, in the introductions, give an overview in terms of 3 very general strategies that are very important in the history of neuroscience, but are also you find in other places, in very kind of biological sciences as well. So the first, and I would say the most widespread, because it's central to physical sciences very much, is mathematisation. So describing what you observe, not in terms of the qualitative richness of all of these things that are happened, but narrowing it down to an event into a few variables which you measure, and then describe a mathematical relationship between them. And so this difference between quantitative and qualitative representation you will see in a science like psychology, especially social psychology, developmental psychology, where the qualitative method is still an option to people. For example, a psychologist can, if they want to, if that's their methodology, observe toddlers in a daycare and kind of verbally describe what they observe in terms of as much sort of richness that they can put down on the page. That would be a very qualitative approach. Or they could go in and design their observations in terms of, okay, there are certain variables that I will measure, such as the number of times each child cries or the number of times each child hits another child. And then that is going to be how they represent the experience. So that's a mathematization of the event in the daycare of toddlers interacting with one another. And you can see, obviously, that's a simplification of all of the different things because you've already predefined the things that you will measure, and then you're working from there. I mean, similarly, you could talk about a qualitative methods in physics, and perhaps this was what was going on in sort of pre-Galilean, pre-modern physics as well, that there was more of a qualitative element in how people were describing just physical events like walls rolling down hills, that, it wasn't so divorced from that sensory richness of experience. People weren't just saying, okay, we're focused on a few variables that we will measure and then mathematically relate to one another.
That was there was a line I read in your book. I think it was last night as I was trying to bash through it before our interview, before our conversation today.
Poor you. Well, I hope you've slept well.
Yeah, I love the book, and one of the lines that stood out to me was the ways in which historians, this will be a paraphrase, unfortunately, I don't have that kind of memory, but the way that historians assume that things are different, but mathematics or scientists might assume that things are the same. Which I thought was a really nice illustration of it, which is when I choose to count things, numbers of times that a toddler hits another toddler, for example, I'm assuming that there is something in common that is with all those times that is relevant, and that the differences are not relevant. I'm going to, I guess, simplify them away. And I'm thinking about that from, again, bringing it back to the kind of work with teams that we do. We try and measure stuff and we go, well, how many, items of work did you do? Or how's everyone feeling on a scale of green to red, or 1 to 10, or something like that. And then you have these numbers and you go, right, well, now I've got some data and I can do some maths with it, or I can visualize it, or something like that. And the thing that sparked me from reading your stuff about that was, when I do that kind of thing, I am making a simplification. And maybe I'll make and I guess will probably be my next question, which is there anything wrong with that? Or what's the how do you manage between getting so in your head that you never make a simplification because you're worried about the things that you're ignoring, versus being able to make like useful simplifications of stuff that have given us all of mathematics and engineering and science and all of the marvels that we use today?
Yeah. Well, I will answer your question quickly before moving on to the other couple of strategies, because we put that on hold. There is the key point you hit upon there is that through quantification, you must necessarily homogenize what you're representing. And you should ask yourself as a methodologist whether that homogenization is legitimate. I would say clearly in the history of the physical sciences, mathematization has paid off. It has delivered a whole bunch of advances within those disciplines. I think in the biological sciences, there's always been more of a question mark, and the social sciences as well, I would say. There's been more of a question mark because there's always been this strain of naturalists of the old-fashioned sort who were really interested in biological particularity. So obviously it's a key component of natural selection that there is variation in biology. You don't have homogeneous populations. So the question is, should we abstract away from heterogeneity or should we not? And of course, in evolutionary biology, quantitative methods are there. It's not like just that we're dealing with variation means that you can't ever use quantitative methods, like it's a very mathematized part of biology. But I would just say the raw fact of biological variation means that this sort of comes up more as a question in a way that it doesn't in physical sciences, because you can just treat samples of elements as effectively the same across different regions and atoms. You can treat them as homogeneous.
So a slab of iron is a slab of iron, but a population of deer are going to be different from each other in different ways, or something like that. Yeah, and I think about that with the teams I work with, which is the variation. Like, our teams have more in common with a biological system than they do with a physical system. And often the tools that we bring as people who do my kind of work is, well, they are assuming that it's some sort of physical system and therefore can be measured and controlled, and it's like a factory. Whereas actually what you have is more of an ecosystem or a population or things like that where the variety is important.
Yeah, and what I would say about psychology and the sciences of the humans is that we know other people are different from one another, and we care about those differences. So if you're looking at populations about animals, you don't have that investment in treating each deer as like, oh, they've got their own unique personality. Though if you want to take the time, you could probably discover that. But for most purposes, when you're fairly instrumental, you're just like abstract away from that. But with other human beings, we have an investment in like recognizing individuality.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess like the people who went to, I don't know, Jane Goodall, who went to get to know was it the bonobos? Yeah. She probably did have a sense of like the ways in which they were different, and then you find out interesting stuff because they're not all just monkeys or apes. Like there are differences in hierarchies and things like that. I'm aware we've got 2 more abstractions to go. No. So we started, number 1 was quantification.
And mathematisation.
Mathematisation.
Yeah, and I would say, and it's been a very important tradition in neuroscience because it involved mathematical models, especially computational models. And that brings me on to the next one, which is the forming of analogies. So this is taking a system or primary examples are machines and inventions, and using that as a template, a model for something in nature which is less familiar and understood because it hasn't been made by people, we don't have a blueprint for it, but using that model system, that machine typically, as a lens through which to view the other thing by looking for similarities between this artifact, this machine, and what's you're encountering in the natural world, looking for those similarities and saying, aha, the operating principles of this machine, can we interpret what's going on in something like the brain as instantiating those same operating principles? So I argue in one of the chapters of the book, this is like a key methodology for how we should, a key methodology for what's been going on in computational neuroscience. So it's not straightforwardly a discovery that the brain is a kind of computer. That's something that's often said, but I would say that understanding the brain as a computer from the very origins of both computer science and neuroscience as we know it today, the computer has been this analogy that's been used in order to make sense of neural function.
And when we make an analogy like the brain is a computer, presumably we lose some richness and we gain some relationships. So how do you know as a scientist, and I know this isn't like the exact question of the study, but how do you know whether your analogy is a good one and is leading you down meaningful, useful relationships, or whether it's leading you astray and you're looking for all the ways in which the brain is a computer and you find answers that are obfuscative or don't help you in some way?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, the quick answer to how do you know this is working is to look at the technological results. And I would say for the brain and computer analogy, given the prevalence and the performance of artificial neural networks, which are very much inspired by this brain-computer analogy, you could say, yeah, this has been a successful strategy. Like thinking of the brain as a kind of computer, interpreting the brain in those terms, led then people to figure out a new way to build information processing systems, or actually implemented in digital computers, getting ideas about how to build artificial cognitive systems through the knowledge of the brain based on this analogy. And we can say, like, engineering wise, it's been it's had a payoff. It's been a successful strategy. But I approach this more as a philosopher than an engineer. And for me, the point is that when you form these analogies, you're tempted to ignore what's different. And philosophically speaking, I think there are so many things about the brain that are not shared with computers, which are probably really important for understanding, if you like, the more mysterious aspects of what the brain does. So it's rolling consciousness, it's the way that it leads to this very integrated sense of self, the coordination between so many different cognitive capacities at once. The thing about machine design is that it's very modular and piecemeal, and there's this weird integralness about the brain, which I think needs to be understood as something more peculiar to organismic biological function, given that computers are not alive. If you're just fixated on the analogy between brains and computers, it, I would say, misdirects you away from looking at the biological basis of cognition. So I think that's been a loss in the science of the moment.
And in ways, it sounds like you're saying, in ways that even the computational neuroscientists wouldn't want. Like they would lose the opportunity to discover the kind of things they want to discover if they assume that it's all just a computer.
Yeah. Though with a caveat there that, every scientific field is pluralistic and there can be some mansion with many rooms, and there is room for that very hardcore computational work to be going on alongside the biological work. And not saying that there should be just one way of doing things, but I would say there's been a certain dominance to the computational framework because it has effectively become quite an entrenched philosophical framework known as the computational theory of mind, which says that what cognition is computation. And one of the tenets of computing in digital systems is that the material basis of computation is irrelevant to understanding the actual algorithmic process, because algorithmic operations are multiply realizable. So you can build computing machines in many different kinds of materials and get the same computation. So if you take that assumption to the brain, then it like tells you can just ignore things about the biological material realization of brains. So things about neurochemistry, hormones, all of those things, which there's good reason to think are really important to what the brain is doing. The computational theory says that's just material realization.
So if I could find a way of like recreating all my cells where like silicon was the base chemical, I should know this because this is what my degree was in, but chemical atom, where you used silicon or you used sulfur or something, and it kept the same shape and you got the same function, would you not be able to say then that, because it sounds like from this argument is with a machine, with a computer, it doesn't matter if it's made of silicon or it doesn't matter if it's made of another thing, you're still doing these computations, it wouldn't make any difference, whereas for biological systems the materiality does matter. What happens when I start developing proteins that are made with a different base chemical or something like that and they still have the same function? Does that not, or is it until we get that, we can cross that bridge when we come to it?
I think we could cross that bridge when we come to it. I think it's an open question how much same function can be retained with such different chemical bases. I mean, to some extent, you do see this in biology, but the digital computing analogy just pushes you towards a very extreme opposite of that idea that actually we should be interested in the material basis of cognitive systems, and just says, oh no, there's nothing to do with what cognition is.
Yeah, and the assumption is ones and zeros, and if we only just change these ones and zeros to a different format, it will be fine, and hormones are just by the by. Whereas
exactly, that your mind could be uploaded in the cloud and you'd still have all the same feelings.
The analogy bit is interesting to me, again, bringing it back to the teams I work with, where often the analogies we bring in do dictate the kind of way we treat our teams. So, for example, Kanban is a system that came out of Toyota manufacturing. And if I come to my modern software team with the assumption that they are a 1970s car manufacturing plant, that's useful in some ways because it allows me to use their way of visualizing work and solving problems. But it's also the case that there are many ways in which a modern software team is not a 1970s Japanese car manufacturing plant. And not realizing that you're making an analogy and a simplifying analogy that loses some information as well is really important. And I think we don't tend to realize, in my world, people get lost between which framework is better. Or is it better to do it in this one or in that one? It's like, well, that one is, let's assume that your team is a Japanese car manufacturing plant. And that one is, let's assume that they're a Swedish music company. And this one is, let's assume that they're an American SEAL team. And like, maybe there's something useful there in all those analogies, but you're still not going to be touching the reality, which is you've got the team that you have in front of you solving the problem that you have in front of you. And every attempt that you make to simplify it is.
Yeah. And then the question is, can you hold all those different analogies in your head at once? Or really, to get the use of the analogy, do you just have to be committed to it and sort of bracket out those other possibilities?
And are you prepared to like swallow the costs of doing that, right? Because if I smudge it and just treat it as if it's a manufacturing plant, well, that makes some bits easier and it makes some bits harder. Whether it makes the bits harder that matter, well, that's sort of up to each system. And I think there's a kind of and I wonder if this is the case in the scientific world as well, that in order to treat my teams like maturely and responsibly and be really aware of the analogies I'm bringing in and the ways that my models are simplifying, it's quite hard. I have to really think about it, and I have to really, know the mechanics of that system and know the mechanics of my system and be really in touch with whether it's helping or hindering. Whereas it's much easier to say all software teams are like the Spotify software teams, and therefore let's just copy their model. So is it the same thing in science where people go, let's just assume it's a computer and shut up and let's see where we get to?
Yeah, I would say for efficiency in science, it's easier to do that. To say we are going to be committed to this way of framing things and just run with that. And I think given a plurality of approaches in science, it can be legitimate to do that. But then I see the role of philosophy of science is actually to do that meta step, that step backwards, given that we're not having to do the day-to-day practical work of sciences, and actually say, okay, on a bigger picture view, you can see this makes sense within the framing that has been used by that group of scientists, but that it could be framed in other ways. Therefore, we shouldn't take the results of that way of framing things to be like the one fundamental truth about how the mind and brain operate, precisely because there are various options, and the starting point for something like the brain-computer analogy isn't self-justifying. It's just in any sort of absolute way. It's justified through its utility because it's a simplifying assumption.
And it produces results. If we found that it wasn't useful, then we wouldn't do it. It's a funny thing with the computer analogy, and I'm aware we've got one more simplifying strategy left, yes. So I'm keeping that tab open. That we built computers to represent or to reproduce a function of the brain, right? This was Turing saying, "Hey, how do I do maths? Yeah. Okay, I'll build a machine that does that." And then we look at the machine and we go, "Oh, that's a lot like a brain, right?" And then we assume that it's and with maybe you can fall into sort of a collapse like that, where if you I don't know what it is, over reverse engineering it or assuming that there's more truth in this model that you've created from your own brain, then maybe we'll find ourselves in weird rabbit holes that are hard to get out of.
Yeah, you hit upon something which I also find quite fascinating about the origin of computers, as Turing described it, is it's taking a particular function, actually a job that people used to do, which is sitting at their desk all day and doing arithmetic and other computations, and saying, okay, how do we mechanize that? But it's funny to me that there's one very narrow job description, which is what the computer is a machine aiming to replicate. Then the idea is the computer is everything, right? It's everything that we do with that.
Yeah, it's another line, and you use some wonderful analogies in the book. One of them was, I think this is relevant here. You can tell me if I've misunderstood it, but it's the Victorian locomotive enthusiast who looks at trains and go, wow, these things are way faster than horses. That means that I can expect in a few years' time, trains will be able to do dressage and will be able to eat hay faster than all other horses. And like that obviously didn't come true because the horses were better at like pulling stuff and moving fast in one plane of motion. And that's like one thing that a horse did, but it wasn't all that a horse did. And maybe if we're expecting our computers...
Exactly. That's exactly the analogy that I use to illustrate that point.
Yeah. So if the mind isn't a computer, what is it?
Well, it's not my job to answer that. No, I mean, what I do say in the book is a positive proposal, but it's not very well developed because it's getting towards the end of a long book, is that the answer to the philosophical questions about what the mind actually is should be sort of framed more in terms of the biological function of cognition. So connecting mind with like the task of an organism needing to stay alive, maintain its integrity. So that's an answer that I very much appeals to me, and it's been developed in other quarters as a strand of research on embodied cognition. It's an idea that actually goes back to Aristotle and various people in biology have explored it. And it even in neuroscience 100 years ago, it was quite a prevalent view. I would say it got sidelined precisely because of the rise of the computation framework, which is precisely has the assumption that whatever cognition is, it's got nothing to do with being alive, because if it's computational, then it's non-living machines have it too.
So if cognition is computation, then like I could be a brain in a vat doing the same thing and not being alive in any sort of meaningful way.
Yeah, it could be a robot. It could be...
So what is the third simplification strategy?
Yes, the third one is reduction, and that is something that is very widespread and has a really important history in biological sciences more generally. Though, of course, you could look back to its origins in classical physics too, but I've been looking at it in more of that biological context where all organisms are complex systems, and it's very hard to make sense of what a complex system is if you just take a whole class and sort of, well, there's all of these parts interacting in these really dense ways. But what reduction tells you is that, okay, you look at the parts before you look at the wholes, you get a really good characterization of what the parts are, and then you work from there trying to build up your characterization of the whole. So in biology, you see this in work in taking cells, looking at them in Petri dishes under microscopes, in neuroscience, doing single neuron recording, individual neurons, trying to get a really good characterization of them, independently of what the rest of the brain is doing, minute descriptions of parts, using that as a starting point to make a stab at the whole system.
Yeah, there was really another interesting chapter. I feel like this podcast is turning into me being like, I read the book and I really liked it. But I guess that's kind of what it's for, right?
The advertising. By the way, it's open access, so people don't even have to buy it.
The best bit, it was free. The chapter on reflexology, which I thought was going to be about helping heal people by pressing different parts of their feet, but it was not about that. It was about reflexes and Pavlov and conditioning and all this stuff. And you can do a better description of it, I'm sure, than I can, describing it as all this stuff. But one of the things I took away from that was the ways in which we... Pavlovian conditioning, Pavlov and his salivating dog, it's kind of like feels like core, discovered, true scientific stuff, right? If I get a dog and I bring in the meat, then it will salivate or whatever the food is. But actually the idea that the Pavlovian conditioning was really hard to reproduce in any meaningful way outside of the lab, and it changed a lot. And there was a whole section where you described the type of assumptions and the type of extra work that people who did these experiments had to do to explain why the results weren't the same. No, the reflex is happening here, but in this case it's doing X, and in the other case it's doing Y because of some other factor that I just made up. And actually something even as popular and well known as Pavlovian conditioning is an abstraction, or it's a reduction down, and then when you try to integrate it back into the whole, it kind of works, kind of doesn't, it depends.
Yeah, this is really highlighting something about psychology, is that you can attempt reductionist methods, but because you can't just wake up an animal and still be studying its psychology, because it has to be alive, it has to be an integrated organism. In biology, you can look at the parts literally in isolation from the whole. Like you amputate some bit of an animal and study it separately. In psychology, you have to maintain the integrity of the whole animal, but you can still try reductionist methods, which is what Pavlov was doing. So he effectively built an isolation chamber for his dogs in the basement of this building in Petrograd, and it was a sound isolation. The experimenter couldn't be in the room, so there's specific conditions that had to be there. So in this case, the reduction is like the separating the dog basically from the rest of the world, and then you could get this reliability of responses, that they will learn the association between the bell or actually the other conditioned stimuli they use and the food reliably when you do this like psychological reduction. And to some extent you can reproduce these phenomena in less constrained conditions, but it's never as reliable. And this was work that was attempted later with Skinner, when he was saying, okay, we can get pigeons to learn all these particular things using operant conditioning, which is a bit different from classical conditioning. in the labs. But then when people try and reproduce this in environments in which, if you like, more of the innate behavioral routines of the animals can start interfering with the trained routines. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, like my girlfriend and I have taught her dog to respond to the Jewish folk song Hava Nagila to mean that he's going for a walk. So there is clearly some truth in classical conditioning.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Like,
what do you think about that?
yeah.
I think I just wanted to gloat.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying it never happens, but one of the things that behavioral psychologists were doing is trying to get this very sort of rigorous, actually mathematized science of learning with, you know, actual learning curves and things like that. And I think broadly speaking, this phenomenon is there, and you can reproduce it. The neurologist Kurt Goldstein, who I mentioned in that chapter, is one of the critics of the reflex theory. His take on this was that he made the point that the whole idea of classical conditioning, you know, it comes from animal training, right? And other techniques and ways that people have anyway tried to get ways of controlling animals. And he called it a kind of drilling. It's like you're internally imposing this way of modulating behavior on the animal in order to get certain results. So he thought of it very much as a technology. And he says that what you don't learn from doing things that way is, if you like, what is learning inherently to the animal. You won't give you insights on what it means for an animal to go through its life in its environment and actually learn stuff. It's very much an imposed framework, and the Pavlovian experimental setup is a very like highly controlled, extreme version of what you and your girlfriend would do with your dog.
And we try and have the controls, but you know he resists being held down in the harness in a basement.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, we don't do that. Fascinatingly, like we kind of have it the wrong way around. I think in popular, I won't speak for the rest of the humans, but in my imagination, in the way I conceptualize it, it's almost as if Pavlov sort of discovered this thing, which is that if you do X, then the dog will do Y pretty much every time. Whereas, like, no, the technology was invented first. And I think you make a similar point with the steam engine, and like we understood the combustion of a steam engine, or like how to make fire, before we had any theory around thermodynamics or anything like that. And, you know, we knew about how to train animals before Pavlov like formalized it. And in a way, reducing down the thing that we already know and trying to imagine that is an essential building block is kind of helpful, but it's also limited and I don't know if it's problematic or whatever. It's complicated. It's not straightforward in lots of ways.
Yeah, it is very much an example of the simplification we were talking about a moment ago, as I draw an analogy. So there are so many sort of technological systems which, as a very fairly well understood, and then they become the starting point for like the question of like how are things in nature in general. So taking like this Pavlov, this drilling, this animal training as the template for, okay, maybe this is what learning is like in general.
Yeah, I think that's something we do again with our teams is trying to find these reducible elements and trying to work out, well, what are some of the key relationships or the key activities that happen in a piece of work, and maybe we can sort of abstract and reduce down to just that. Or I can draw a process map. That's kind of what happens when we draw process maps. We try to work out what are all the elements in the reduction, but we miss the things that we miss. So if I draw a process map of all the things that happen as a piece of software is produced, I miss the fact that actually a really important part of it is where my two software developers like have a chat over lunch. Now that's not like a repeatable part of the process maybe, and it's not something that I could like mandate, but it is part of it, and it's hard to get on and there will always be infinite things that don't go on the map that are important. So when we're managing or curating or stewarding these teams, we have to be aware of the fact that there's only again, when we're doing a reduction, we're doing something, we're making a simplification, we're missing some information, there's a certain there's a mystery out there that we may never be able to capture every way in which the work gets done, or the way this distributed mind works.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the obstacle to reduction is, as a methodology, is it has to make the assumption that parts behave the same way in isolation as they do in wholes. But when you can't make that assumption, then you've got a limit on what you can learn about the whole system from the study of its parts. So people in a group obviously behave differently from one group to another versus working in isolation. And so you can clearly see that there's going to be an obstacle to just purely trying that reductive approach.
And also the fact that like two people on two teams will be different. Or two people on the same team will be different. People are different. And so if I take a method or a framework or something like that and it worked really well in one circumstance, well, even if it looks really similar to me, this new circumstance, it may be that the thing works, but it also just may not for these reasons of like heterogeneity. And people are different and things are different. And if I try and homogenize and just treat people as reducible, replaceable parts, then I miss an element of reality that's really important to us in doing our work. It interested me when we were talking at the beginning about the role of vision sciences. That is a kind, and you said, well, that's something that's easy for scientists to do.
I wouldn't say easy, maybe easier.
Misphrasing it, but it's something that is accessible for scientists to do, is to have a loop between the stuff that I show and a neuron or an eye or a nerve and the things that I can measure there. And that's also a kind of abstraction, right? And if we do lots of vision science because it's more accessible to us to do vision science than it is to do other kinds of science, well, that will skew our understanding of what cognition is.
Yeah, and that's right. I compare in the book the way, the direction of research on primary visual cortex with research on motor cortex. So motor cortex is often thought of as like the output of the brain. So the input side as sensory data coming in. This feeds into decision making in the middle, and then there's a motor output, which is the commands for the muscles to make an observable behavior. And the motor side has something of this accessibility that you see in the sensory cortex, in that it was discovered back in the 19th century that stimulating certain parts of motor cortex would reliably seem to invoke certain kinds of muscle twitches. So a lot of work subsequent to that on neurons in the motor cortex was really trying to discover what are the invariant relationships between neural activations and movements or muscle commands, etc. And a lot of it was inspired by like the success of those kinds of mappings of discoveries with sensory cortex, but it was found that motor cortex neurons tended to drift more in terms of what movement variables were correlated with them. So this imposition of the model of what worked in the sensory cortex to the motor cortex turned out to be a bit of an obstacle to lots of things. But still, I mean, motor cortex is it's a tricky area. It's been a hard enough to crack on people.
Similarly, I don't know if it quite relates, but it goes back to the Pavlov thing, which is I can't remember who it was. Who described, I think, a Polish scientist that redid the experiments, but took the bell out of the clapper, unbeknownst to the experimenter. So everything was completely reproduced, but it was, And then when the assistant or whoever it was like came in with the food and then went to ring the bell didn't ring, but the dog still salivated.
Yes.
And it was like maybe the case that the dog wasn't being conditioned to the input of the bell, but the appearance of the assistant, or something like that. And the way, I'm going to have to find who it is and put it in the show notes. There's always something for the show notes, other than just a massive link to Brain Abstracted. It's great. Was that the bell was a stimulus, but not for the dog, but for Pavlov,
Yes.
which I quite like. So yes, even when we're trying to study these systems, the thing that we're choosing to study and the place that we're putting our attention is not just a given in the environment. Which I think takes us on to a question, which is, you mentioned earlier that Kant is your favourite philosopher. What is it about Kant that makes him your favourite?
I would say it's not Kant's philosophy in general. I can't say I'm an expert on his ethics, and there's lots of things about the sort of general sort of fetishization of reason and rationality that I wouldn't want to sign up to. However, as I withdraw from him, he's been very much an inspirational figure for how you should approach questions about philosophy of science, because I think he first articulated what has become for me the core issues is like what is brought to the table before you begin investigation in order to make the discovery and knowledge possible. When he talked about like the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, he was talking about the a priori, the things that we assume about nature, about that there is causality, that things happen in space and time. Without these, science is not possible. You can disagree with him about all of the things that he said were there as the categories or the forms of intuition, space and time and forms and intuitions, and all of this deduction he has of the categories. Philosophers since then have said, no, that's not right. But I think the core component of his approach is that what are the conditions of the possibility of the science, i.e. what needs to be assumed to get inquiry off the ground. For me, that is still the central question. It's the one that intrigues me the most. And that's really what has sort of led me to this thing of, okay, let's think about abstraction, because this is precisely where you see these framing assumptions getting made.
Yeah, and that is a very coherent approach with cognitive science. They're like, what needs to be possible here? Because I guess, probably it has its roots in Kant rather than Kant for happening to invent the same thing. But yeah, questioning that. And I think that's... I experience my own little sort of less cosmically important version of that in work, which is trying to work out at what level to pay attention when in the very real world of working with teams and problems and user experiences and all this sort of like meaty stuff. It can often be seen as quite like, I don't know, navel-gazy or irrelevant, or why go back to like these first principles, and why be talking about like cognition and minds in the context of this stuff. My sense is, and I think that's what attracts me to this field of cognitive science and to that approach, is to, when you question that stuff, you just uncover things about the way you're thinking about a problem that matter. And if you don't go back to those principles and don't question, is my team more like a physical system or a biological system, you'll miss opportunities to help them. And then the meaty stuff, the meat and potatoes, will be harder or won't be as effective. Is that your hope for the work that you do, that scientists in the labs will be, having read your book, will change their approach or will think about it in the way that they go and explore, or is it something else?
So it's not something that I had like explicitly as an ambition when I wrote the book. I think I was wanting to be more modest than that, which is like, this is an issue that philosophers need to pay more attention to. Scientists, to the extent that they are communicating with the public, also need to be paying attention to this. But I wasn't, I say in the introduction, I'm not trying to change what scientists are doing. The point is not to change neuroscience, but to interpret it. But I have to say, I've been pleasantly surprised since the book came up that neuroscientists, a few of them have spoken to me about this and said they've been reading this, and that said that it's been actually useful to thinking about some of the issues that they're finding in the lab and theorization. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised that it's had an audience with people actually dealing with the coalface of research.
One of the topics, or one of the ideas that I think you introduce in the book, is this idea of haptic realism. So without going into maybe the down and dirty of realism versus anti-realism and alternatives, what is haptic realism and what sort of role does it play?
Yeah, I mean, I should say something about what realism is, because there's a variant of realism. I mean, I would say what realism is, when we're talking about scientific realism, is this thinking of science is basically a mirror of nature. There's nature out there, and science is trying as best as possible to like hold this mirror up to nature, record what's in the mirror. That's your theory. Ultimately, when science is getting it right, it's just telling you how nature is by itself without interference from scientists or anyone else. It's what Kant called the thing in itself. It's just how everything as things are independently of human interpretation and human mind. And it struck me that this way of thinking about how science operates is inspired ultimately by how we think of vision as giving us knowledge of the world. So we just open our eyes and this richness of visual experience sort of presents itself to us and we're like, aha, that's just how it is. It doesn't seem like the way the world looks to us is in any way to do with how we happen to interact with the world, how our visual system happens to be responding to the world. And the observations sort of came up when I was thinking about color vision, and I was thinking, well, maybe there are ways of interpreting visual experiences that actually make us more aware of the perceived dependence of visual phenomena. That's actually something that I go into in the book back then, but I think there's a very common take on how vision comes across is to just like mind-independent reality. We just absorb it. That's it. There's nothing that we bring to the table. Whereas saying with haptics, with a sense of touch, you cannot ignore the fact that how you experience things are to do with how you go about interacting with things. So say I pick up a glass with the certain purpose of like having a drink, then I'll touch it in a certain way. How I choose to move my hands will affect the way that I experience the glass. So that notion of like the distance between the person who's aiming to know things and the thing that is aiming to be known, this assumption of distance, lack of interaction, you cannot assume that if your root metaphor for how knowledge is operating is coming from the sense of touch and haptics as opposed to this ideal of how vision operates. So what I call haptic realism is a way of thinking about scientific realism which foregrounds the activity of the scientist. So science only achieves knowledge because of particular ways that scientists choose to intervene on the world. It's a philosophy of science which is really focused, geared towards experimental sciences. There are other branches of sciences which are not experimental, which are arguably excluded from this account. But anyway, if we restrict ourselves to experimental sciences, it's obvious that you are taking things into the lab, you are interacting with them in certain ways. That's the starting point for your observations and your theory. So you should not ignore the fact that all of these processes are happening, and these are going to affect how you ultimately understand and account for these things that are going on in nature. And then it's a further question of whether the theory that you achieve through these methods generalizes completely to how things are in nature independently of you.
So how would a scientist that knows about haptic realism observably be different from a scientist that doesn't know about haptic realism? I say observably, but how would you observe them? I guess I'd have to be a haptic realist in that, but that's too meta.
Yeah, I mean, these are theories of what scientific knowledge is ultimately delivering, which, arguably don't affect scientific practice. I mean, there was a debate over this. The classical opponent of scientific realism is a view known as instrumentalism. And this was a debate about the reality of unobservable particles like atoms. So the scientific realist said that atoms exist just in the way that theory describes them. An instrumentalist would say that the scientific theory is only committed to the claims it makes about observable reality, and anything that you say hypothetically about the existence of unobservables, you need not be committed to that. And there's questions about which view on science was most fruitful in disciplines like quantum mechanics, which went through a very instrumentalist phase precisely because it's so hard to interpret quantum mechanics. So it's sort of convenient to sort of back off. Okay, we're not going to say that we're committed to a vision of reality based on what the scientific theory is literally describing about things. It's not that quantum physicists were like necessarily saying that these particles didn't exist, but they were happy to say that, okay, we're committed to the theory to the extent that it gives us accurate predictions, and we're just going to bracket the question of like, what's it actually telling us about unobservable reality. So there's an instance where these questions of whether you're a scientific realist sort of arguably do play a role in actually how scientists are conceiving their own work. In the with the question of haptic realism, what I'm saying, the lesson specifically for neuroscience is that we should not reify our abstractions. We shouldn't say that the simplified version of the brain that we have developed through all of these processes that we've described is the literal truth of how things are in the brain. I don't think it changes how scientists operate in the lab, but I think it certainly changes what you would draw philosophically or informally in your communication of your results to other groups and other parties.
Yeah, and then maybe that filters down into the kinds of certainty that knuckle draggers like myself would then interpret from that, and we go, well, actually, it's not the case that science says X or Y, which can be dangerous, right? Which if policymakers and people who decide stuff in the world, which is all of us, are not well informed about the fact that scientific consensus is an abstraction or is a model or is contains all these assumptions in there, then we might make decisions that we don't want to be making.
Yeah, I mean, I think a particular implication here is about, the status of neuroscience with respect to the behavioral sciences, psychology, cognitive science that deal with whole behaving peoples and animals as opposed to bits of their brains. Because given like a general preference for reductionism, neuroscience has often been perceived to be like the most hardcore science of the mind, that's going to inform us about the mind, not just the brain. And given the reliance of neuroscience on idealizations, the way that behavior has to be constrained in the lab in order to get certain results, there's an argument coming from haptic realism that, okay, for any question about who should we go to about the nature of this cognitive capacity, we shouldn't just assume that the neuroscience is going to give us the most fundamental, most generally correct answer. It could well be that the behavioral scientists, given that they don't have to make such radical abstractions, gives us more relevant information about the questions that we're having about behavior as it takes place with actual people.
Yeah, and it allows us to have a way of understanding that truths are distributed and don't just sit with one ultimately best discipline or something like that. And I think as team coaches and things like that, that's a really helpful starting point to remember that when we're kind of like scientists for our teams, kind of. There's, I don't know, the more I think about that, the more I think that's not quite true, but there is this idea where we run experiments and we try and see patterns and things like that. I think we're more like philosophers of our teams, but that's a different question. But the idea that I'm not seeing the thing in itself when I measure something, I'm seeing something that my imprint is really relevant there and is shaping the kind of thing that I'm seeing, and you sort of can't get away from that. And then that's in a way that's quite freeing, because it means that I can hold a healthy skepticism towards the results that I find, or the patterns that I notice, because I say, well, I was there, I was using certain instruments, and those instruments might just be like questions or conversations that I have, but I'm not going to capture the essence of the thing any more than a scientist could.
Yeah. I mean, one of the messages of haptic realism is precisely that you cannot discount the impact of the scientists themselves on the thing that they are investigating. And I thought that's just super important in social psychology. I mean, all of those are experiments that were done, and you to have the psychologists in their white coat and their stern expression saying, okay, because I'm the scientist, I'm not going to have an impact on what's going on, so I have to just be super neutral, as if having this imposing figure that is super neutral and affectless is not going to have an effect on the person, right? Whatever you do, there's a social, psychological effect. Or if you have someone in isolation and there's no experiment to that, still that's a variable, you're changing something.
Reminds me of there was something I learned about university was some attempt to code the genome of a Neanderthal specimen that they found. They would probably resent me calling them a specimen. Neanderthals remains. That feels worse. Anyway, and to see what they look like, and they put it through the machine or whatever, and they put it up on the computer, and they were like, "Hey, that looks a lot like our lab assistant that did the work." And they were like, "Yeah, I think he may have just sequenced himself there by mistake." I think that's maybe the satire end of it.
Yeah, there's always room for contingency in error in science as well.
I think that takes us on some mad failed scientific experiment from 2 decades ago. Feels like a nice place to draw to a close. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on Agile on the Mind.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been really fun talking, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss all this.
Thank you very much.